Check, check. I would like to announce my candidacy for President of the United States. I was told this would be a musical. Anyone else hear that? Good. Okay. So today we're going to talk 300 years of watchmaking history. I promise you it won't take 300 years. We're going to discuss the fundamentals from basically the cylinder escapement to the present. And I'd like to thank our hosts, your host and mine, the Siddiquis, Dubai Watch Week, and Horology Forum 10. I want to thank everyone who came out, everyone from Paul, who's circling about, to my team here at the 1916 Company, of course, Waco, and the entire cast and crew backstage who made this technically possible. So thanks to all of you, one and all. Okay, jumping straight into the program. We'll give everyone a chance to take a seat. All right. So, 300 years of watchmaking. First things first. We will get to the wristwatches, I promise you. But 300 years, and I am not 300 years old, does encompass a considerable period of pocket watches and clocks. And we're going to go through all of the fundamentals so we know where we came from. By the end, we'll be talking about wristwatches as well as the brands that we all know and love on the forearm. So bear with me, and I promise no one will fall asleep. Okay, up to 1724. While verge escapement clocks date approximately to the 13th century, it's very important to note that watches as a type didn't really emerge until the 16th century. In the 15th, we began to see things along the lines of wearable clocks, and they were very much miniaturized versions of what you would find in the bell tower of a church. In terms of accuracy and precision, you got one hand, because when something is off by hours a day, that's the only hand you need. Accuracy was truly tragic. We didn't have hairsprings, we didn't have going barrels, we didn't have lever escapements, we didn't even have cylinders. So the best you could do was a watch that was approximately 2 to 3 hours off per day, which meant daily resetting, assuming you had the resources. Now, also important during this period, we saw the introduction of the waistcoat. This happened in the 17th century, more or less, as we were witnessing the rise of the pocket watch, which began to slim down the wearable clock into what we would today describe as a pocket watch, circular, flat, and broad, suitable for fitting in a man's pocket. Now, in the beginning, this is what we had. The verge, which is the vertical shaft and the two poles, and the folio, which is sort of like a proto-balance wheel. Now, if you look carefully here, you can see that this version of it features hanging masses. So this was clearly on a clock. The version that would go into a watch was virtually indistinguishable. Now, here's the thing about the verge. We love it because it was our firstborn, not because it was our brightest. So if you take a look at what it needed on a daily basis just to get to within an hour or two running accuracy per day, it required a fusee and chain constant force system. Now initially this would have meant using a piece of gut, essentially the innards of an animal transformed into a twine. Later on, chains would be used. Fun fact, they were often assembled by children. So if you've ever seen Oliver Twist asking for more, now you know why. A fusee is a little bit like a dancing bear. A verge is a little bit like a dancing bear. You combine these two things and it's remarkable. It's not going to be a great dancer. It's not going to be a great timekeeper. But the miracle of a dancing bear is not that it dances like Fred Astaire and Ginger here, but that it dances at all. And so the verge escapement is just like a dancing bear. It's a bad dancer doing its best. Now here's the thing. As bad as the verge was, remember this in watchmaking, anything that has been refined to the utmost is always better than a crude version of a superior technology. So we will return to the verge escapement in glory later on in this discussion. Now, a major breakthrough occurred in the 17th century as Robert Hooke and Christian Huygens more or less both arrived at the same conclusion at the same time, which is that if you wanted a better timekeeper that you could carry, you needed to use some sort of balance spring. Now, Hooke probably had the idea first, but what seems unarguable is that Huygens actually built it into a timekeeper first. And so we went from having an inaccuracy of about 1 to 2 hours a day to about 10 minutes on a really well-made well-made verge, fusee, and hairspring timepiece in the second half of the 17th century. Now we're beginning to look at watches that are genuinely worth owning from a timekeeping standpoint, and we also see the introduction during this period of minute hands, because the watches are now accurate to minutes a day rather than hours. But you can see it's still very much the verge. Now, here's the thing. Technology and fashion sometimes go hand in hand. And the very first fashion trend in the history of the watch industry gripped watchmakers in the early 18th century. And this was the cylinder escapement. Why? Because with a cylinder escapement, you now have the ability to make a very thin watch. Thin was in, then and now. And finally, we had a watch that could be slender instead of round or ovoid or egg-like. So with the cylinder escapement, this is a great example created by Jacques-Frédéric Ourier in a text by Jean-Claude Sabrier, you can actually see right here how this works. So we've got the barrel, the hands, we've got our drivetrain, and then here we have our cylinder. It's a frictional rest type escapement, which means the impulsing and impulsed surfaces between the cylinder and the escape wheel, they're always in contact. It's a grinding, imperfect, primitive way of making an escapement, and it's common to many of the early escapements from the verge all the way up to the duplex. But the critical thing here, because you remember that cheeseburger verge, it was about that big? This is very thin. Now we can make fashionably thin watches that could also be considered reasonably good timekeepers. We are moving on from the verge here. That's the verge. You can see the thickness. That's the cylinder. And now you can see exactly how the cylinder works. So the cylinder, initially made of metal, later made of ruby, is a partial cylinder. It actually has an open arc. Over here, you could see how the escape wheel, which is turning in this direction, could impulse the cylinder, which is attached to the balance wheel. As it does so, the opposite side of the cylinder moves into contact with the next impulsing pin. So you could see whether resting or impulsing, there's always frictional contact between these two surfaces. But it worked well, and it did improve the science of timekeeping, because George Daniels gushed over Breguet's ruby cylinders, which were capable of keeping time to, wait for it, a minute a day. Now, that's great for timekeeping if you are ground-bound and a landlubber, but if you want to engage in marine navigation, this means you're going to be off by about 15 miles per day, which is basically crap. Let's call it what it is. So you're dead because you gained or lost 60 seconds a day. By the way, the real deal. I was lucky enough to take one of these things and get a great look at number 1602, Breguet subscription pocket watch. This thing had it all. It had a compensation curb for the hairspring. It had parachute. It had the ruby cylinder. This thing was the bomb. And I'll be honest, it sold for less than a chronometry bleu, so priorities. Now, a major innovation, and this is the one that really brings us into the doorstep of the modern era, but in the mid-18th century, Thomas Mudge created the lever escapement, which reveals two things. One, the lever escapement is a relatively modern invention. Two, the Swiss lever is not Swiss at all. So, aside from plagiarism and a, shall we say, cagey bit of marketing by the Swiss, all of these advantages are common to lever escapements. It is now detached, meaning this roller table at the base of the balance has an impulse jewel. Here's the lever. As it passes, you can see the roller table and the impulse jewel, it only passes through the horns of the anchor periodically. It is not constantly in contact with the anchor. That dramatically reduces the friction necessary to operate the mechanism, which improves everything, including timekeeping, reduces maintenance requirements, extends power reserves. It has minimal impulse friction, since you only have these tiny impulsed and impulsing surfaces between the escape wheel and the impulse face of the entry and the exit stone right there. So very little lost energy, even when it is in contact and impulsing. It's thin, which, as we all know, is highly desirable desirable for fashion's sake. And this is a big one. It's self-starting. Start to wind that watch, and it immediately jumps into action once it has sufficient torque. This is very important because, as you'll see, there are a couple of escapements that need to be manually started. So if for any reason they stop, they are stopped dead. If this system is shocked, it can restart itself. And that would be absolutely critical if, for example, your wristwatch would stop and not restart itself. So this would have great impact down the line as watches move from the pocket to the wrist. But it is a better timekeeper. It does have one disadvantage, especially in period, which is that the demands of making it, both the component itself and the jewels attached, made it prohibitive for all but the wealthiest to own. Even on early marine chronometers, you will find this was not used. So, moving on now to the heartbeat of the watch. A verge sounds like a typewriter. A cylinder is almost silent. A lever has the familiar tick and tock heartbeat that we associate with a watch today. So you can thank Mr. Mudge for the modern tick-tock. Not going to give him credit necessarily for the app, but certainly for the sound of the watch. Moving on, in the mid-18th century, we saw a revolution in balance wheel design. And this is important because Frenchman Pierre Leroy came up with a solution to one of the greatest weaknesses of the hairspring, and one that Hooke and Huygens could never overcome, which is that as temperature changes, it will either become a lazy beater or a hyperactive beater, depending on whether you're getting hot or cold. So the idea of a split compensated balance is now introduced, and this would be refined through time by Arnold and Earnshaw. But the basic idea is, since we have a split in the rim on two sides, we also have a combination of brass and steel, and these metals don't expand or contract at the same rates. So by mounting one half of the split wheel on one spoke of the balance and the other on the opposite spoke, it can now move like a lever arm in and out. So if the spring wants to speed up the watch due to the temperature, then the changing geometry of the balance wheel in real time will slow it down, and vice versa. So this idea of having a split bimetallic compensated balance would dominate for pretty much the next almost 200 years of watchmaking, and it was an extraordinary breakthrough because now, with this kind of hairspring, with this kind of balance, with a lever escapement, we can start to talk about watches that are, at least in theory, capable of keeping time to within seconds rather than minutes per day. By the way, heading back, this is from a 1920s Illinois Bunn 60-hour pocket watch that I took apart for your viewing pleasure. This is beautiful. You can get something like this for $400 US. This is a crash course in watchmaking fundamentals and something anyone can go out and pick up off of eBay right now. By the way, you could also tune the timekeeping by moving the masses closer to the split itself. If you thought you were going to deal with particularly extreme temperatures, either in the Arctic or in the tropics, there was even more adjustability to this system. Now, I spoke about navigation earlier and why a minute-accurate watch would be an absolute disaster. Well, here's the thing. The British realized as much, and if you are a country predicated on empire, and that empire requires naval navigation, you need the best possible timekeeper possible. So here's the thing. If you want to figure out where you are north-south on the celestial sphere, you use a sextant and a declination table, and that's fairly easy to do. The problem is, if you want to know where you are east and west, north-south is easy, east and west is hard. But it was understood, even early on, that the Earth would rotate in 24 hours, which meant 1 hour was approximately 15 degrees east or west. So, if you had a reference timekeeper, because it's easy to find local time, you can find local time by mobile means at sea, but you need to know Greenwich Mean Time. You need to know the time at the prime meridian. And you need a watch that can be set to GMT when you leave port and stay set to it, because 4 seconds of inaccuracy by your navigation clock is 1 nautical mile east and west. Those seconds add up, you find yourself on the rocks. So, the ability to keep time well and hold that reference time at sea was absolutely critical to the point that the British were willing to offer the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern-day money to anyone who could solve the problem of longitude, and it took some time. The Board of Longitude and the Longitude Act were originally passed in 1714 under Queen Anne. We'll talk about how long it took to get to this John Harrison H4 naval chronometer. So, a quick note about chronometers at sea. They were literally lifesavers. Fun fact from American seafaring history, in 1831, the whale ship Essex was rammed and sunk by a sperm whale that decided to take the fight to the whalers. In the process of sinking, the crew grabbed everything they didn't need, including weapons, water, food, all sorts of things you might conventionally expect to need. They didn't bring the means of precise navigation. So, initially, as guys started dying, they ate the corpse. When guys didn't die fast enough, they drew straws and decided who would be shot and consumed. This actually happened, which meant that in 1851, someone out there is laughing at that. Way, I knew it would be you. This guy thinks Terrifier 3 is a date movie. So we've got the Anne Alexander, 1851. This is an earlier photo of the ship. Another whale ship sunk by a sperm whale. As it was going down, the captain ran into his cabin and he grabbed 4 things: a sextant, a declination chart, a projection chart, and a chronometer, realizing that if he could navigate north back to the shipping lanes, he could expect to be picked up within days. They didn't get water. They didn't get food. They didn't pick up weapons. They got navigation tools. Now, this is in the mid-1850s, so we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But this story has a happy ending. They were picked up 2 days later in their whale ships. They got back to the shipping lanes. They were found. Now, the Longitude Prize. It took Harrison years to get to the H4. He started work on the H1, which was a giant clock and the first of 3, in the 1730s. He spent 5 years on the H1, 3 years on the H2, 17 years of futility on the H3, and 6 years making this, his magnum opus. So this watch is a lot bigger than it looks. It's 13 centimeters across. You could not wear this. You could not put it in your pocket. But compared to the giant podium-style clocks that he initially built, this was the cutting edge. Now here's the thing. It worked, and it worked really well, to the point that it was accurate to within a few seconds a day, and I should mention, this is sort of the revenge of the verge escapement. Remember when I said absolute refinement is more important than having the latest technology? This is a great example of that. It had a diamond pallet stone verge escapement, the first ever watch remontoire constant force device, and a fusee and chain all together. It was considered to be a state secret by the British government, and it was extraordinarily successful in trials at sea in the 1860s. Ultimately, Harrison never collected the full Longitude Prize because they basically said he got lucky. Well, after a number of naval trials and getting lucky for several years on end, George III, the King of England, ultimately helped him to obtain I would say the closest thing to the lion's share of the Longitude Prize. He got 8,000 British pounds. In total, he received somewhere around the equivalent of a modern-day 4.5 million US dollars for his innovations in chronometry, and he saved a lot of lives. However, the idea of using a verge on the cutting edge of timekeeping technology didn't sit well with those who had better ideas. And once again, we get into Pierre Leroy, who you will find is seemingly at the inception of all the really cool ideas in the 18th century. He came up with the idea of a chronometer escapement that had everything going for it. It was detached, it was low friction, and it required very little lubrication in an era when vegetable oils and animal fats were still being used to create lubricants, and thus lubricants degraded very quickly. But once again, it was the English who got the most out of the concept. Leroy and Arnold created chronometer escapements that used a pivoted detent, a detent with its own separate hairspring, which was both vulnerable to temperature changes and unnecessarily complicated. So it was Thomas Earnshaw who created the version that you see right here, where now, instead of having a hairspring and a pivot, this linear blade, this leaf spring, is now the actual spring of the detent. This shaft right here is the detent. This is the roller table with the balance, and this is the escape wheel. And this is the coolest escapement ever created. Now, taking a look here, you can see all of the advantages. This was even better for timekeeping's sake than the lever escapement. And by the way, John Harrison was shocked to learn that Thomas Mudge's lever escapement pocket watches could keep the same time as his giant navigation clocks. So don't underestimate the lever escapement, but this was the next step up. Extremely low friction, detached escapement, direct impulse. Notice what you don't have here. There is no lever. Unlike the lever escapement here, we have the escape wheel and we have the impulse roller of the balance, and they are touching directly. So cutting out the lever right here, you have the wheel acting directly against the balance. Now, getting a little bit more granular, it did have shortfalls. It was not suited to watches because under conditions of shock, it could be damaged or it could stop. And it was not self-starting, so if it did stop, it couldn't resume operation. Warning, some tech minutia. I promise you, I will make it as painless as possible. Useful rule, too. All right. Unlike Professor Farnsworth, who's a scientific man, all this was accomplished by trial and error, not theory. So the way it works is you have the detent, which is this long, straight metal construction. This is your escape wheel, which is geared and in constant tension by the drivetrain of the watch or the clock. Now here you have, keep in mind, it moves in this direction, clockwise. You have a little blocking jewel that holds the escape wheel in place. Now over here, you have the roller table of the balance. So the balance wheel is on this axis. It's attached to this device. As this passing spring is lifted by the trigger jewel, this blocking jewel is lifted out of the way. The escape wheel rotates just as the impulse roller of the balance is passing, and so you have this tangential contact. Once every 2 turns of the balance gets impulsed, and this now allows you to create a watch that will lose fractions of seconds per day. When this roller table moves in this direction, it unlocks because this little passing spring lifts the whole detent up and unlocks the escape wheel. But when it turns in the opposite direction, you can see that there's just enough clearance that this passing spring is pushed down and allows the balance to move in this direction without displacing the detent. I know that's a lot of jargon, but it's a very simple mechanism. And what it does essentially is it reduces friction to the utmost. That's enough of that. That can get very technical, and technical can get very dry. I was told this was supposed to be musical. Also, have you ever noticed Avion? Backwards, it's roughly pronounced naive. Are they playing us? I'm just saying. That might be tap water right there. And in case you're falling asleep out there, here's an action-packed scene from Gladiator. We're all looking forward to the sequel. Okay. Late 18th century innovations. Now we are into the first half of Abraham Louis Breguet's career. Ferdinand Berthoud, John Earnshaw, Arnold, all sorts of notable watchmakers were active in the middle to late 18th century. So Breguet created the tourbillon regulator in 1795. He patented it in the early 19th century, but he created the idea in 1795. Now, the idea here is that if a watch is sitting in your pocket, it's pretty much on one axis on a full-time basis. So if you can rotate the escapement and the balance structure in your pocket, gravity will even out the effects of deviation and imprecision. But it has to sit in that one orientation or it doesn't work, which is why not great for wristwatches, but we'll get there. Also, shock protection. Let's go back to this watch that I had the privilege of examining. This little spring right here is called parachute, and this is the earliest known version of shock protection on a watch. Now, it's over the balance staff pivot of this pocket watch, and the idea is that if there is a shock, it'll jump out of its seat jewel, it'll move the capstone, and the capstone will gently ease it back into position. This had 2 purposes. 1, avoid fracturing the balance staff pivot. 2, more rapidly recenter the pivot in its cup jewel for better chronometry. So this was both for durability and chronometric sake. You can also see that in 1780, Breguet broached the idea of automatic winding by hammer. And it was a great idea, it just didn't work that well because, quite frankly, pocket watches don't move around that much. And the ones that do tend not to survive too long. But if you do look on a modern-day Breguet tradition automatic winder, you'll see this crescent-shaped or scythe-shaped oscillating mass. So automatic winding, shock protection, you will see these again later. Now, the 19th century, this is where horology reaches maturity as an instrument of science, mathematics, and actual cutting-edge innovation. By the time we get to the 20th century, we start to look at other timekeepers. But in 1851, at the first World's Fair in Britain, in the Crystal Palace, everything from consumer goods to horology, steam, electricity, magnetism, scientific innovations, things that were ready for delivery, things that foretold the future. It was an exciting time. We're not quite there, but in the early 19th century, we see Breguet's natural escapement. Now, this is probably the prince of direct impulse escapement systems, because now you have two wheels, you have no lever, you have a locking system to keep one of them stationary, but this is the roller table for the balance, and each one of these wheels only impulses the balance in its direction of travel, forward and backwards. Of course, this is from George Daniels. I try to be as transparent as I can about my sources here. But whereas we had the chronometer escapement only impulsing in one direction, once every 2 times the balance rotates, now we get a direct impulse in both directions for a more robust, even-keeled timekeeper and a more forceful impulse of the regulator. Now that's an interesting one because it's going to come back later in the lecture, so I just thought I'd highlight that. Breguet's never worked well. It had a tendency to jam up, it wasn't self-starting, it required technology and tolerances he did not have in his day. But this was a portent of things to come. That's Zenith. And Zenith, founded in 1865 in Loloc, was one of the first true manufacturers. What does that mean? Well, integrating horological trades at a factory. In the 19th century, we moved from solo practitioners working in their shop or their cottage or maybe a small practice in Geneva, in Paris, in London, to the integration of the skills needed to make a watch in more of an industrial setting. Now, this was still craft knowledge, but at the same time, we would now have dozens of watchmakers and artisans rather than 1, 2, or 3. Here's Audemars Piguet, here's IWC by 1875. IWC, by the way, also taking advantage of an early hydropower scheme to run the manufacture. Moving beyond the cottage industry, this is no longer something that Swiss farmers did in their off-season. And you could see that American watchmaking was leading the way by the middle of the 19th century. Here you could see the United States Watch Company in New Jersey. Here's Waltham in Massachusetts. Here's Elgin in Illinois. What do they all have in common? These are large industrial factories. There is very little romantic about these environs. They were also able to make better watches than just about anyone in the world had ever seen. So these two men and a gentleman named Nelson P. Stratton founded the Boston Watch Company in 1852. They were focused on mass production of superior timekeepers that could be purchased at the salary of an industrial worker. Now at the time, if you were to build a watch in Switzerland or Britain or France, every piece would be custom made for the application, which meant if you had 5 watches and you took them all apart, mixed the parts together, even if they were identical models, those parts would not go back together and function properly. But the example of American railroad and armaments manufacture gave these men the idea of using those methodologies of scientific engineering, mathematical calculation, and machine-based mass production to create superior timekeepers. And the American Civil War accelerated the process as the country became more industrial and its industry became more mechanized and driven not so much by craft knowledge, but by engineers. And in 1876, it arguably reached its zenith. The Swiss came over, the British came over, the French came over, and they were shocked by what they saw. Interchangeable parts, mass production, a watch as accurate as a chronometer that an industrial worker could purchase with 5 to 6 months' salary. They saw watches taken apart, strewn about on tables, mixed with other parts from similar models, reassembled, functioning perfectly. And they saw machines that could take a piece of raw wire, process it, and moments later spit out a perfectly finished screw. And this became a turning point for the Swiss watch industry. They realized that if they didn't get with this program, they were going to be bankrupt, and the future of watchmaking was going to be American. And in fact, the failure of the British and the French to adapt these techniques ultimately led to their eclipse and obsolescence as leaders in watchmaking technology in the second half of the 19th century and into the first half of the 20th century. There would still be some high-end watches, there would still be some small makes of repute, but by and large, it was this movement of mass production in the American style that led to the end of high-end British and French watchmaking. Okay, so how good was an American railroad-grade watch? Well, the thing you need to know is that if you've ever heard the Grateful Dead Casey Jones song, it was inspired by one of the colossal pileups that occurred on American railroads when inaccurately set watches led to two steam locomotives sitting on top of each other at the same time, which was a giant, violent, disastrous mess. So, Webster Ball, who was already active in horology and railroad timing in the era, was asked by the American railroad industry to standardize the terms of what an American railroad watch would be. And here's the key thing: 5-position adjustment, lever escapement, micro regulator with an overcoil, accurate to 30 seconds per week. At that rate, these watches could get a Swiss COSC chronometer certification. And again, they cost a few months' salary for a railroad worker. These watches could have been used for navigation at sea in the 17th and 18th century. Even in the 19th century, this level of accuracy on something you could buy for relatively little money was almost unheard of. We also began to see the advent of wristwatches in the 19th century. Patek Philippe originally created this one in 1868 for a woman. Allegedly, Girard-Perregaux created watches for the German Navy in the 1880s. I've never seen a picture of it, and I've never seen documentation. But the fact that they claim it all means that Girard-Perregaux today understands that this was a transitional period. Like many things in the watch industry, the first sighting of the type occurred decades before it became common. Now, the milestones of 20th century watchmaking include, among other things, effective advertising. Things like celebrity endorsements. They also included new technologies like water resistance. And in the 20th century, we saw wristwatches arrive in earnest. Now, in the early 1900s, we saw it was both the first Cartier wristwatch and the first pilot's watch, the Cartier Santos, not for a pilot of a fixed-wing aircraft, but dirigibles, airships. The most common type of early wristwatch, which you can actually see here from one of my collector conversations, was a converted pocket watch, an officer-style watch. Just as Alberto Santos Dumont needed both hands to drive his airship and thus couldn't resort to his pockets, officers and soldiers in the trenches of World War I often needed both hands free, and thus a watch worn on the wrist was easier to read at a moment's notice in the heat of battle. So this officer's watch class of conversions became the most common early type of wristwatch, and when the war ended, the soldiers brought the wristwatch and the taste for the wristwatch back home with them. Now, technology in the first third of the 20th century was primarily geared towards materials. Charles-Edouard Guillaume, Swiss physicist, this is the artist, he was a Nobel Prize winner in 1920 for physics, and his focus was nickel-iron alloys. He created Invar in 1896, was a highly thermally resilient hairspring and balance material. In 1913, he created Elinvar, which is Invar, iron, nickel, and now adding chromium, which is also anti-magnetic. Here's the thing. When you added an Invar balance and an Elinvar hairspring, suddenly you had a watch whose balance would need no adjustment, that had extraordinary resistance to magnetism, temperature drift, that essentially could keep outstanding time in every position and in every atmospheric condition. And this was the beginning of the end of split balances. Now, he also created a split balance using a combination of brass and a material he called anabol. So if you've ever heard the term Guillaume balance, that's exactly what it is. It's a split balance that has anabol on the inside. That was a super high nickel iron alloy. Now, Elinvar hairsprings were so thermally inert that the split balance was basically abolished, but it got better because we had other alloys coming about. In the 1930s, we get Nivarox, which is similar to Elinvar, but a different alloy in detail. Now we have something that is resistant to oxidation in that it doesn't rust. It is profoundly resistant to temperature fluctuations. It is ideal for hairsprings. This was created in about 1933 by Reinhard Straumann. Now here, Glucideur is a beryllium bronze, beryllium copper and iron for balance wheels. When you put these two things together with a lever escapement, you have a modern watch. And the only difference here is the degree of adjustment and quality of the parts. But this is the birth of the modern oscillator. When you combine Nivarox with Glucideur, I would hazard to guess we have several of those in the room today. And it largely completed the extinction of the split compensated balance that had begun with the advent of Elinvar in 1913. Now, hey sports watch fans, here's three big ones. Stainless steel. 1808 stainless steel was invented by the British firm Firth Brown in the 1920s. And once it was adjusted to deal with wrist oils, it became a dominant watchmaking material in the 1940s and 50s. The initial version of Stay Bright was actually quite susceptible to corrosion on the wrist. It was designed for things like cutlery and utensils. But about a decade and a half to 2 decades later, they were adjusting the alloy to deal with wrist oils, and suddenly the era of the stainless steel watch came in, ushered out the era of the sterling silver watch, because that had previously been the reliable go-to if you wanted a corrosion-resistant watch material. Water resistance, made famous by Rolex in 1926, but pursued by many through the 1920s, 40s, and 50s. And this is actually the Omega Marine. It was a sleeve case that was highly water resistant. This was their solution in the 1930s. Ultimately, Rolex's solution of using rubber seals, screw-down crowns, and casebacks was the one that would decide the direction of watchmaking and water-resistant watchmaking in the future. Finally, shock protection. Inca Block of 1934. We talked about Parachute with the Breguet pocket watch. Inca Block picked up where Breguet left off, and when you combine these things, stainless steel, water resistance, and shock protection, you have all of the ingredients for a modern sports watch. That's a lot of boring physics, so I apologize. And since Halloween is approaching, here are 3 adorable guinea pigs with costume suggestions for your furry friends. I like the hot dog right there, although the witch is cute. Now, as we get into the middle of the 20th century, there are changes in the ways watches are made internally. First of all, the idea of having an offset train. This is an F. Pigeon Octa 1300, and you could see that it's dominated by an enormous mainspring barrel and a large balance wheel. By moving the drivetrain of the watch off to the side, we free up space for the barrel and the oscillator. There's no reason to stick with a center wheel architecture like a pocket watch if you can design a new watch from scratch for the wrist. So the advent of wristwatches did away with the old school center wheel architecture of the pocket watch. We also saw some conversions of center wheel movements. Now, this is a modern construction by Dornbluth, but they deliberately echoed the early 20th century to mid-20th century use of indirect center seconds, where you have this third wheel that's driving both the fourth wheel and a center seconds pinion with a pivot that goes all the way through the cannon pinion up to the dial where it bears the seconds hand. So this was how center wheel wristwatch movements were converted to a center second display in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. This is a modern or zenith type offset architecture. That's what that's called. And then finally, it was important because starting in the 1920s, the idea of an automatic winding wristwatch was advanced. And this is a Rolex 3135 that I took apart that shows how Rolex, with its 1931 patent perpetual system, accomplished an automatic winding system. So I took this apart so you could see the winding system here. It's bidirectional with Teflon-coated reversing wheels, and that's what it looks like in the modern era. But historically, Rolex would have done it with a rotor, and they had a long-term patent, which is why all the other brands came out with bumper-style automatic systems in wristwatch formats until the 1950s. Okay, so we've seen what happened with the changes in alloys, hairsprings, balances in the early 20th century, the advent of stainless steel and shock protection. And we saw the changes in the internals of the watches, indirect center seconds, offset trains, and automatic winding. But from 1969 to 1985, there was a crisis in Swiss watchmaking. By the way, do you ever notice how only the Swiss call it a crisis? I never heard anyone who worked at Seiko say, oh yeah, 1969 to 1985, that was terrible. But it was a reckoning for the Swiss watch industry. And in December of 1969, the Seiko Astron 35 SQ hit the market. It heralded a paradigm change in the industry. Now, it was not in and of itself a cheap product. It cost $1,250 back then, which was the price of a very substantial used car. But like many things in the industry, the harbinger speaks to the future, and this would become a ubiquitous and cheap technology within the decade. By Seiko's own account, quartz watches officially outsold mechanical for the first time in 1982. Hundreds of Swiss watch brands and tens of thousands of jobs were lost during this period, which is very sad. So I want to pick you up with these adorable micro pigs, and if this doesn't melt your heart, I don't know what will. If you don't like pigs, I also have pugs. Bad news, though, through the early 1980s. Managed bankruptcies in Switzerland as the collapsing SSIH, which was Omega and Tissot, and ASWAG, which was Glucidur, Nivarox, and ETA. They were merged into SMH in 1983. Ernst Thomke, who was really the technical genius overseeing what would become the Swatch Group, and Nicholas Hayek, who was sort of the business mind behind it, built the company whose fast fashion Swatch watches funded a portfolio of purchased luxury brands in the 90s and 2000s. Swatch Group, as it would later be called, laid down a pattern that was followed by Richemont and LVMH in the 90s and 2000s. And it became clear that mechanical watchmaking could only endure by offering romantic nostalgia and permanence. We're no longer talking about science. We're no longer talking about navigation. This is no longer necessary in any way other than in the sense that a hand-painted portrait of your family is necessary if you have the money. And if you don't, you get a photograph. This is watchmaking becoming art, portraiture, the racehorse. And here's the thing. It did. In the 1980s, we began to see things the likes of which we'd never seen from mechanical watch brands. Tritone, white, yellow, and rose gold compound bracelets from Rolex with diamond set dials and mother of pearl. We began to see wristwatch tourbillon. This is the tourbillon automatique from 1986 from Audemars Piguet. We have the 1985 perpetual calendar chrono Da Vinci from IWC and the 1990 Grand Complication, also from IWC. Patek Philippe capped 150 years with the Caliber 89, 33 complications in a double-sided watch the size of a grapefruit. None of this is necessary, but it takes the tropes of historical high watchmaking and makes them luxuries, something it is a privilege to own, not a necessity. Now, mechanical watchmaking is like Secretariat here. This was the ultimate racehorse, a product of good breeding, proper training, skillful riding, all things that are hundreds of years old. But the fastest racehorse will never be as fast as the slowest Formula One car. So we are seeking to refine an ancient technology rather than raise it to the level of one that is modern but a commodity. Now, Daniels and the coaxial escapement. This is the original version. This is the tri-level version that you'll find in a modern Omega. So what you're looking at here is both direct impulse and indirect impulse. So it works a little bit like a chronometer escapement, and it also works a little bit like a lever. In 1999, Omega industrialized this. Daniels had spent the better part of a quarter century trying to sell it to a major watch brand. And this was one of the first mass-produced alternative escapements that we would see in our era. Laurent Ferrier would also try to maximize watchmaking precision by taking Breguet's old natural escapement and updating it with materials like nickel phosphorus and silicon. By the way, double direct impulse by F.P. Journe, Charles Frodsham, Bernard Lederer, Kari Voutilainen, and Ulysse Nardin have all adopted the techniques that Breguet first broached. Audemars Piguet gave us the super high frequency AP escapement based on the chronometer escapement first broached by Robert Robin in 1790s. We see a renewed interest in high watchmaking from the 1700s and 1800s being put into modern watches. And I said the chronometer escapement wasn't useful for watches and wristwatches, but I lied, because Raoul Pages built one, and he was awarded for it. And you can actually see how much this looks like the chronometer escapement we saw earlier when we discussed Earnshaw's chronometer, detent, escapement. We also saw new fabrication methods, computer-controlled CNC. Jaeger-LeCoultre bought its first CNC mill and the software to operate it in 1982. It became the first of many. We also start to see deep reactive ion etching, one component made by an acid bath controlled by a computer that replaces 30 parts in a watch. We also began to see galvanic lithography, again computer controlled, that could build something like a Rolex Chronology escapement. Look at these hollow spokes. Look at these hollow escape wheels. That can't be done by machining. You can't do that with a drill. You can't do that with a lathe. So these are new processes that are making watches in ways never seen before. It's still mechanical watchmaking, but sometimes the technology behind the watchmaking is as important as what you're actually wearing on your wrist. This has changed the industry. Now, hand drafting to CAD-CAM. Patek Philippe, right here, this is the Henry Graves super complication, 8 years to conceive and build. This is Kurt Klaus. He hand drafted the IWC perpetual calendar module. Right here, we have Dominique Loiseau's Blancpain, 1735. Not only 6 years to make, because he insisted on doing it by hand, but 744 parts. Philippe Dufour is actually okay with using software, but only for two-dimensional profile views of the train. And then finally, CAD Mad. I actually saw the Tambour Opera Automato when I went to LV, and this was on a computer fully functioning before it was ever constructed. This watch right here was entirely concepted using engineering software before a single prototype was made. The future has two faces, as I see it. One is going to be mechanical watches built with increasing levels of automation and machine fabrication that speed production, improve timing, lower costs, or accomplish all of the above. This is the $5,000 Frédéric Constant manufacture monolithic. This little disc right here beats at 288,000 vibrations per hour. This can't be done without computers. This can't be done without deep reactive ion etching. And while it is undoubtedly a step forward in technology, I am not sure it's necessarily more endearing, but it is one thread of modern horology. The other is a return to the source, going back to the era of entirely handmade watches, undoing everything I just showed you in terms of technology, going back before the era of American factory watchmaking, and now having one small constructor build watches in his own image under his own name. This is Josh Shapiro of the United States, former high school principal. He's a better watchmaker. This is made in a space the size of this room. The case, the dial, and the movement, all of them. A space the size of this room by 5 watchmakers and artisans. And here, you really get the flavor and the feel for those people. It's almost like when you hold it, you're holding the hand of the creator. This is much more emotional. I have to be perfectly honest, this is the horology that I love. And I have to say, although we as watch collectors tend to be a very pessimistic community, we're always worried about the next generation, or we're worried about that the patrimony of the past will fade away, or techniques will be lost, or that no one will be around to inherit our watches because our kids don't care. I find that to be wrong. Look around. We've got people of all ages in this audience. When I started getting interested in watches in the 1990s, we had magazines. They were weird and expensive and hard to find. Sorry, Wei. But they got me started. All the people who were into watches, though, were far away in Asia or Europe, and they were generally much older. Now, when I was a young college graduate in the 2000s, we had the internet. Now we had websites, we had message boards, but we didn't have organic communities where you could be more than a name on a forum. By the time I was in the Navy in the 2010s, now we had social media. You could be yourself. You could participate in communities of like-minded enthusiasts. But all of the industry events, like SIHH and Baselworld, they were geared toward the industry. If you weren't a journalist or a vendor, you weren't getting anything out of those shows. And now here I am, in Hong Kong, at an event organized by a crew from Dubai, speaking as a person from Philadelphia and New York. And I have to say, for all the pessimism in the watch space, I look around at the faces of the friends in the audience, and I feel that the future is very bright. Thanks, guys.